On December 1st, 2022, the Mendoza Criminal Court stood waiting, holding its breath. The atmosphere in the courtroom was tense, and the surrounding area was filled with people waiting for the verdict. On the dock sat a woman aged 32, dressed in a black dress, with white beads around her neck. Her face expressed not a single emotion, and her eyes burned with only equanimity and restraint. She was preparing to hear the judgment that would determine her fate and leave a mark on history. Everyone in the room had known this woman for many years, but now they were faced with a mystery that was difficult for them to understand. Outside the courtroom doors, the approaching footsteps of the judge could be heard, like the pounding of a heart, echoing in the silence and felt in every corner of the place. Everyone knew that what was at stake today was not only the fate of the woman in the dock, but also the truth that had remained in the shadows for so long. There was a whole story behind this woman, the events of which were as mysterious as she was. The truth of this real crime is hidden in the details, and the trial becomes a real challenge for all involved. Monado is a small town hidden among the mountains and valleys of the Argentine province of Mendoza. This is the place where nature reveals its most beautiful colors. In autumn, the streets are sprinkled with golden leaves, and the mountain peaks are painted in shades of orange and red. The residents of Monado know each other well, and everyone can tell the biography of their neighbors. Here, people share joys and sorrows, support each other in difficult moments, and celebrate important events together. In this secluded place, among the mountains and valleys, Rolando Angeliquino and Karen Oviedo began a romance that would later shake Monado and all of Argentina. When the streets of the city, surrounded by colors of autumn gold, as if frozen in anticipation of something long awaited, the fates of the two young people of this story intertwined. Rolando Angeliquino, a man with a magnetism capable of attracting the attention of others, could not help but notice the exciting gaze of Karen Oviedo. She was a woman with fire in her eyes, a passion for life, and an energy that instantly won his heart. The young people were very similar in their interests and dreams, and the determination and entrepreneurial thirst of both inspired them. This meeting was an accident that gave them a chance for true happiness. Finally, they found in this relationship what they had been looking for in others for so long. So in 2016, the lovers started living together and opened their own business, a warehouse, which was located in the house where they lived. Karen has always had a special eye for detail, and she lovingly created a sign on one of the windows for customer service. Next to it were lists of items for sale. It was their little corner that they were rightfully proud of. The people of Monado watched this happy and determined couple with interest and respect. Everyone wondered who these young people were and how they managed to accomplish so much. Many people knew Karen from childhood, but Rolando remained a mystery. No one knew anything about his past, except that he came from Bolivia. Rolando not only ran the business with Karen, but also worked at the fair in Guimalin, where wholesale fruit sales were held. Looking at this couple, it seemed like they had found their little paradise on earth. But sometimes, even the strongest and most sincere relationships can face a test. One day, Rolando was taken aback when he caught Karen in the car with another man. His reaction was a flash of anger. In that moment, he nearly destroyed everything inside the interior of the car. The picture of happiness crumbled in a matter of minutes. But then, Rolando agreed to give them a chance, choosing to forgive and continue to move forward with his beloved. In the eyes of others, they remained a model of an ideal couple, able to overcome all difficulties together. Rolando Angeliquino is an enigmatic figure who was born in 1987 in Bolivia. His exact date of arrival in Argentina remains unknown, like many other aspects of his life. As the eldest of 7 children in his family, Rolando learned from an early age the value of family bonds and hard work. His ideal was a happy family filled with joy and children's laughter. In his youth, he met Carolina Chavez, from whom he later had a son. Despite the difficulties, the couple remained on good terms. Later in his life appeared Soledad Guardio, who gave him another son, Elias. Relationships with Soledad also did not work out. However, Rolando was always a devoted father who took care of his children. He kept in touch and always maintained a warm relationship with the mothers of his children. From a young age, Rolando was a physically fit man who took care of his health by playing sports and playing soccer for the local team. Colleagues and loved ones described him as a kind and very hard-working man. Neighbors in his neighborhood got along well with him, but Rolando always showed a distinct shyness in socializing. Karen was born March 30th, 1990, and spent her childhood and youth in Minato, in the same house where she and Rolando later established their warehouse. She was well known among the locals as an outgoing and open-minded woman. Like Rolando, Karen dreamed of a happy and successful family with a caring and devotedly loving man. However, it took her some time to find the one man with whom she could build her happiness. Before meeting Rolando, Karen had already attempted to create a happy relationship that resulted in the birth of two wonderful girls. One of her former partners, Raul Ojeda, became the father of one of them, and Karen married him in 2013. However, as time went on, that marriage was on the verge of breaking up. According to Raul, financial difficulties were one of the reasons for the conflict. Worried about his life and in search of new opportunities, Raul decided to leave his family. On the pretext of buying some necessary item, he fled the city and traveled abroad, changing buses to make it difficult to track his whereabouts. In this way, he sought to evade all attempts to locate him. In the summer of 2019, 9-year-old Elias arrived at Rolando and Karen's house. They had many plans for the near future that they wanted to spend together. However, on the morning of July 12, 2019, when Rolando came to wish his son a good morning before leaving for work, he noticed that the boy was not feeling well. The father immediately decided to take his son to the children's hospital to see a pediatrician. There, after examination, it became clear that Elias's condition is critical, and he was immediately sent to the intensive care unit. Despite the best efforts of the medical staff, little Elias died shortly after he was brought to the hospital. The amazing thing was that he left home perfectly healthy, without any unusual symptoms, and arrived at his father's house also perfectly healthy. However, the medical report was devastating. It stated that Elias died of third-degree poisoning, which caused multi-organ failure and cerebral. These conclusions left Elias's parents in complete bewilderment, as their son seemed to be completely healthy and active, and suddenly died of an incomprehensible disease. Following their professional duty, the doctors insisted on conducting an additional forensic medical examination. However, Elias's mother and grandmother, dumbfounded by the loss, refused this procedure. Karen offered to cremate the boy's body, but Elias's mother also refused, preferring to bury her son in a private cemetery so that she could come and lay flowers on his grave. Elias's death was a blow that broke Rolando's heart. He was devastated by the unexpected loss of his youngest son. The caring and loving Karen never left Rolando for a moment. She took care of all the business, carefully supported her boyfriend, and helped him through his pain and grief. Over time, with the warmth and support of the woman he loved, the pain began to subside. 16 months after this terrible tragedy, Rolando decided to take a big step and propose to Karen. They got married, and the man was sure that this woman would always be by his side. However, their happiness turned out to be short-lived. On February 6, 2022, Karen returned home after a beauty salon and working out at the gym, and noticed that Rolando began to experience serious health problems. The next day, February 7th, she found a medical ambulance outside their home. Rolando, 35, suddenly felt very ill. After vomiting profusely, he collapsed in the living room of their home, and the housekeeper called for emergency medical help. The doctors allowed Karen to pass to her husband. When Rolando was taken to the Santa Maria clinic, his condition was critical. Despite the efforts of the medical staff, the young man passed away on February 9th. But now the cause of his death was severe poisoning. Given that Rolando was a healthy man who was active in sports, the medical staff began to ask questions of his wife. Karen confirmed that Rolando was taking medication to remove dark spots on his skin. For specialists, this information was highly suspicious. tests revealed a significant excess of calcium oxalate crystals in Rolando's system, which is a characteristic sign of poisoning by ethylene glycol, the main component of antifreeze for cars. The investigation into this strange and unexpected death of Rolando became a high priority for authorities. The prosecutor's office was actively investigating the neighborhood where the Aquino couple lived. Neighbors became important witnesses, reporting that Karen had repeatedly given her husband some unknown medication. They were aware that she used these medications to go to a party without her husband. However, neighbors also expressed doubts about what happened to Rolando's son, which led investigators to think and consider the theory that Karen may have only wanted to temporarily sedate her husband rather than take his life. However, the findings of the Technology Crimes Unit officers completely ruled out this hypothesis. Requests for various forensic examinations were sent, and Karen, the wife of the deceased, was thoroughly questioned. Many contradictions arose during the interrogation. The investigating officers called on Karen to name the substance she had slipped to her husband before his death. The woman claimed that it was just a skin blemish remedy and that she had administered it through an IV. However, when she was asked to provide a vial of the solution, Karen said that the housekeeper had already thrown the drug away. A further interview was then conducted with the housekeeper, Claudia Cortez, who denied Karen's statement regarding the discarded vial. Of both inspired them. This meeting was an accident that gave them a chance for true happiness. She also reported that she had overheard a conversation between the couple in which Rolando expressed dissatisfaction with the medication he was receiving. Karen was detained during the investigation, and her cell phone was seized. Rolando's family, friends, and teammates were shocked by the news of his death. For visitors to the Aquino couple's warehouse and other locals, it was also a shock. No one could understand what had happened or why the father of the family had bid farewell to the world so suddenly. Raul, Karen's ex-husband, was extremely surprised when rumors of a deliberate poisoning began to spread. He claimed that his ex-spouse was always affectionate and never violent towards him. After analyzing the suspect's phone, it was discovered that Karen had searched a search engine for information on the deadliest poisons and how to clear her search history. In addition, records of her 2 ethylene glycol orders from an online store were found. The Agency for Toxic Substances, as well as the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, found that it is a synthetic substance that absorbs water and is used in the production of antifreeze. This product is odorless, has a sweet taste, and is extremely dangerous to humans. With the preliminary results of the forensic examination and all the information discovered, the prosecutor's office charged Karen with willfully poisoning Rolando with a poisonous substance diluted with orange juice. Consumption of this beverage caused Rolando's health to seriously deteriorate, and he died. A series of strange and tragic events in the Aquino family forced the authorities to take drastic action. By mid-February, with enough evidence against Karen, an aggravated murder charge was filed. In parallel, suspicions surfaced as to the cause of 9-year-old Elias's death, triggering a new investigation. The mother claimed that Elias was fully healthy and active, and that he had suddenly gone into a coma while at his father's house, from which he never came out. The boy's death certificate indicated that the cause was a malfunction of his internal systems and cerebral thrombosis. However, investigators persistently doubted that Elias, at age 9, could have died of such causes, especially given his overall health. The prosecutor's office requested information about possible purchases of ethylene glycol and received a response confirming that Karen purchased the poison on July 2, 2019, shortly before the boy arrived at the Aquino home. Information from Elias's relatives also confirmed that Karen insisted on cremating his body, but the birth mother rejected the idea and preferred to bury her son. The evidence gathered was enough for prosecutor Claudia Rios to file new aggravated murder charges against Karen on March 4th, related to the poisoning of Elias. On March 14th, a judge ordered pre-trial detention for the woman, who tried to appeal, but the judge rejected it, affirming that she should remain behind bars until the trial began. That trial began 10 months later and was an important step in unraveling this complex and dark story. The long-awaited trial began in the Mendoza Criminal Court, attracting public immediate attention. November 28, 2022 was the beginning of the nationwide trial of Karen Oviedo. 2 indictments were pending. The first, led by prosecutor Fernando Guzzo, concerned the murder of Elias, and the second, involving Claudia Rios, touched on the murder of Rolando. When the trial began, Rolando's eldest son, Javier Aquino, who was only 15 years old, appeared as a plaintiff, supported by counsel. And in search of new opportunities, Raul decided to. In addition, Kimberly's own blood was not on the murder weapon or on her hands, which would be impossible if she had actually shot herself in the head with the gun to her chin. But there was a drop of her husband's blood on the thumb of her hand. On top of that, there were several searches on Christopher's work computer for detailed staging of the crime scene. Kimberly's physician also testified at the trial, stating that the young woman suffered from insomnia, headaches, and high blood pressure, for which she was prescribed a number of medications, but that she had no bad thoughts or desire to harm herself or others. The defendant was found guilty on each of the counts charged. For such a horrific crime, Christopher was sentenced to 4 life sentences, 1 for each family member, with no possibility of ever being released. Shortly after such a harsh sentence was handed down, Vaughn unexpectedly stated that he remembered in great detail the events of that day and had not lost his memory at all. According to him, shots rang out after he left the car, but he did not immediately realize what was happening. Then he saw the bodies of the children, and at that moment, his wife shot him in the leg. She shouted that it was all his fault, and then put a bullet in his head. The new testimony of the convict had no effect on the verdict because it sounded more than ridiculous. However, Christopher's parents have been actively trying to justify their son in the eyes of the public. For several years, they regularly take part in all sorts of talk shows, give interviews and blogs and social networks, where they talk about how unhappy in marriage was their heir. They also systematically blame all the troubles on the Phillips family, whose members, according to them, from the very beginning, did not accept their son-in-law and did everything to turn his life into a nightmare. The prosecution decided to address several questions to Karen. Prosecutor Guzzo, focusing on key points, asked her if Karen had suggested that her son Rolando be cremated. To this question, Karen responded emphatically that the decision on this matter was not up to her, and she had never made any such suggestion. The prosecution called as witnesses relatives of the deceased to reveal further details of what had happened. Soledad, Elias's mother, told the court that after her son's death, on December 20th, 2017, a press conference was held during which Mark Perez, special agent in charge of the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, announced a breakthrough in the disappearance of Mike Williams, a Tallahassee real estate appraiser who was originally presumed to have drowned while duck hunting on Lake Seminole on December 16, 2000, and was eaten by alligators. "Being here now, I can tell you what happened to Mike Williams," Perez said. "Mike Williams did not drown in the lake. He wasn't eaten by alligators. He didn't leave town and leave his wife and 18-month-old daughter behind. He was murdered. In the interest of the investigation, we cannot yet release details, but I am happy to report that this morning investigators notified the Williams family of recent discoveries in the case." Today's story is not only about love, betrayal, infidelity, and greed, but also about a mother's resilience. For 17 years and 4 days, Cheryl Williams, Mike's mom, disagreed that her son had drowned in Lake Seminole and pushed with tenacity for law enforcement to investigate her son's disappearance. She believed with all her heart that those responsible would be punished, believed even when no one else did. "I had 2 choices. He was alive or dead. I chose to believe he was alive, and I really think that's what helped me," Cheryl said on December 20th, 2017. "A lot of people called me crazy, but if I had given up, we never would have found him." The day before the press conference, Brian Winchester, a close friend of Mike and his wife Denise, who later married Brian, was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Mike's mother was right. Retribution came to those responsible, and ironically, they were the cause of the truth coming out. In 2000, Brian and Denise's affair, which began in 1997, turned into a murder. And years later, they went from lovers to strangers who didn't trust each other. Brian was very afraid that after the divorce, Denise would inform the police about what had happened to Mike, so he attacked her. Denise, on the other hand, went to great lengths to get him a life sentence. She was very persuasive in asking the jury for the maximum sentence, and it was these efforts that led to Brian having nothing to lose, and he made a deal with the prosecutor. Brian was sentenced to 20 years in 2017 for the kidnapping of Denise Williams, but he avoided a life sentence. Denise was celebrating the victory and was unaware that the conviction was part of a deal in which Brian Winchester, 49, admitted to planning the murder and a 17-year cover-up of the murder and received immunity from any prosecution for his role in the case. In exchange, he led investigators to Mike's body and gave a full and truthful confession. It would only be a few months later, and on May 8, 2018, Denise Williams would be arrested. At first glance, things are a little confusing, aren't they? Let's break down this case in detail. Jerry Michael Williams was born on October 16, 1969, in Bradfordville, north of Tallahassee, the son of a bus driver and a kindergarten teacher. Family and friends called him Mike. Even though the family didn't have much money, and the boy, along with his older brother, grew up living in a trailer, those were happy times. The parents cared about their son's future, and instead of building a house, they set aside money for the education of both boys, who themselves worked part-time at night in supermarkets. The sons enrolled in North Florida Christian High School. There, Mike excelled. He became student council president, played soccer, and was active in the Key Club. At the age of 15, Mike started duck hunting as a hobby and met Denise Merrill. The young lad was a soccer player and student council president. Denise was a cheerleader and council secretary, and they began dating. Friends thought they were a great couple. While still in high school, Mike became best friends with Brian Winchester, whom Denise introduced him to. Brian later had a friend, Katie Thomas, and the two couples remained friends for the rest of Mike's life. After high school, Mike attended Florida State University, where he majored in political science and urban planning. The lovers graduated together. Denise became a public accountant. Mike became a real estate appraiser. Mike proved to be a valuable worker. He often worked 15 hours a day, and of course his career took off. In 1994, the young, successful man married Denise. It was around this time that Brian married Kathy as well. All four of them continued to stay in close contact. Mike loved his wife dearly, strived to provide for their family as best he could, and had incredible energy. At the age of 31, Mike Williams achieved considerable success. As a real estate appraiser, he was earning nearly $200,000 a year. The couple was able to afford a home in a small, upscale neighborhood on the east side of town, and in 1999 became happy parents. They had a daughter, whom the couple named Ansley. Mike's friends told me that he was always prudent. Since the young man was engaged in quite risky activities, he wanted to be sure that in case of disaster, his family would definitely be taken care of. Not surprisingly, Mike turned to his best friend, who was working as an insurance agent at the time. Ryan sold him 2 insurance policies for $250,000 and later for $500,000. In 2000, Mike's father passed away. Williams was so stunned by this suddenness that, wanting to financially secure his own family, he again turned to a friend. Brian helped Mike to insure his life for $1 million. Thus, about 6 months before his disappearance, the life of the loving father of the family was insured for almost $2 million. According to Denise, on the morning of December 16, 2000, her husband woke up early to go duck hunting on Lake Seminole, a large reservoir connected to the Apalachicola River. It was the day of their 6th wedding anniversary, and the couple planned to celebrate the date at night in Apalachicola, a small town on the bayou. The wife and daughter waited for Mike at home at noon, but he never returned. Naturally, Denise became concerned and called her father, who in turn called Mike's best friend, Brian Winchester. Together with his father, Brian drove to Lake Seminole. There they found Mike's Ford Bronco car near the boat dock. But Mike himself was nowhere to be found. The men went around to all the places Mike liked to hunt, but couldn't even find the boat. So they decided to call the police. After investigators from the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Agency were called, The search for Mike began. A few hours later, the helicopter pilot found the boat drifting about 225 feet from the boat ramp. The search of the boat turned up Mike's shotgun, still in its case. Apparently, he never got to use it. The search became a rescue operation. Locals believed that before the three rivers were dammed to form the lake, the reservoir was the site of an orchard. Thus, the lake got its name Springfield, due to the many remaining stumps that protruded above and below the water level, requiring careful handling of any motorized boat in the area. Because of this, searchers speculated that Williams hit a stump on his boat, fell out, and submerged himself in the water. His wading boots filled with water, and he probably drowned when he couldn't get out. Several other agencies were called in to help, including a dive team from Montgomery, Alabama, and the Jackson County Sheriff's Office. But the extensive and methodical search yielded nothing. Mike was never located. A week passed and the rescue operation turned into a body search operation. Teams were given probe holes to probe the bottom of the lake, and dogs were brought to the site. 10 days into the search, volunteers found a camouflage-patterned hunting hat that could not be linked to Williams. Officials with the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Agency speculated that Mike had been eaten by alligators, which is why the body could not be found. There were actually quite a few alligators living in the lake. The Florida Department of Law Enforcement found no signs indicating a violent death and agreed with that theory. After 5 weeks, the search was called off. The day after the search was called off, Denise held a memorial service for Mike, less than 2 months after the alleged accident. It seemed to everyone that Denise had come to terms with the loss of her husband, but Mike's mother had not. 6 months later, in June 2001, an angler discovered wading boots floating in the lake. Divers searched the lake area and retrieved a lightweight hunting jacket and flashlight from the bottom. In one of the jacket's pockets was a hunting license with Williams's name and signature. The find raised many questions. Neither the hunting jacket nor the boots had visible teeth marks indicative of an alligator attack. None of the items found showed signs of having been in the water for 6 months. The boots were not slimy and the flashlight still worked. However, a week later, Denise's attorney asked the court to declare Mike Williams dead. Based on the items found, he suggested that alligators and other aquatic life had swallowed the body whole. The motion was granted. The death certificate said Mike died on December 16, 2000. Cause of death: accidental drowning while duck hunting on Lake Seminole. The body has yet to be recovered. This is how Mike Williams' story might have ended if not for Cheryl Williams, who refused to give up and continued to search for her son. "All I know is that I can't stop looking for him until I find him," she said. Cheryl's efforts seriously strained her relationship with her former sister-in-law. Denise demanded she stop searching and accept reality. She said, "I'm tired of seeing articles about Mike and his disappearance. I just want to move on with my life. If you keep pushing this investigation, you will never see your granddaughter again." Cheryl couldn't give up on her son, and Denise carried out her threat. If not for the mother's persistence, her son's story might have remained submerged at the bottom of a dark, algae-covered lake. It took Cheryl Williams 3 years to convince law enforcement officials to open an investigation into her young son's disappearance. "I made phone calls, put up signs about my missing son, wrote to the governor of Florida every day, compiled my notes into an evidence book, asked people to post on social media, and contacted reporters," Cheryl will tell you years later. The persistent mother contacted Matthew Oresco, an alligator expert. In his response, he explained that alligators do not feed during the cold winter months. Cold weather causes water temperatures to drop, so alligators don't feed in the winter. All they do is maintain their body temperature. 14 degrees is too cold for an alligator to be interested in food at all. Moreover, Oresco wrote that after an alligator kill, there is always forensic evidence left behind. Eventually, after 3 years, Cheryl Williams convinced law enforcement to drop the ridiculous alligator theory and launch an official investigation into her son's disappearance. The case was reopened because of little-known facts regarding alligators' eating habits. Evidence gathered from interviews and a little official data convinced investigators that Williams' death was no accident. My gut feeling is that Mike did not die in Lake Seminole, and that's the general consensus of all the law enforcement agencies working on this case. said Ronnie Austin, a former investigator with the 2nd District State's Attorney's Office who prosecuted Mike's case. The Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Agency initially took over the case because Williams was considered a missing hunter. Officers spent 735 hours searching a 10-acre section of the lake for the body, but didn't spend a minute looking for signs of wrongdoing. Jackson County Sheriff's deputies brought in to help with the search also did not consider other possibilities. Investigators interviewed everyone involved in the search, and police officer David Arnett, who was present at the scene that day, years later said, "Some things immediately looked strange. Williams didn't usually hunt alone. His truck was found in an undeveloped area from which he would have had to drag the boat over mud, not on the nearby concrete boat launch he usually used. The terrible storm that night should have pushed the boat to the east shore, but it was found on the west shore. The boat's motor wasn't running, but it was full of gasoline. If Mike had been driving the boat and fell out of it, it would have continued to float in circles until it ran out of gas." Unfortunately, law enforcement began to doubt too late that they were dealing with a simple drowning. The crime scene had already been trampled by numerous volunteers and searchers. A car that could have served as a clue was taken by the family without any verification. Potential witnesses were missed. Denise Williams and Brian Winchester became suspicious to investigators because they learned that Winchester had divorced his wife Kathy and married Denise. They also learned of Denise's unexpected financial gain of nearly $2 million from her late husband's life insurance policy. Detectives determined that it was Winchester who sold the policy to Mike. They also found it strange that Denise, as Mike's wife, did not want to have anything to do with the investigation and tried to prevent Cheryl's activity, even forbidding the grandmother to communicate with her granddaughter. In 2005, the newly married couple were called in for questioning, which gave nothing new to the investigation. Brian provided an alibi for the morning of the disappearance of Mike Williams. He said he was 60 miles from the lake, at home, in bed, as his ex-wife Kathy could attest. He said he had intended to go hunting with his father-in-law in the morning, but overslept. Denise's interrogation also yielded no new leads. In 2008, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement announced that Mike's disappearance was not an accident, and they believe he was the victim of a crime. However, without sufficient evidence, they alas cannot prosecute. We have suspicions, but we need proof. Another investigation failed to find out her son's fate, but Cheryl Williams did not give up again. Her efforts led to the Discovery Cable Channel doing a story on Mike's disappearance and subsequent investigations in late 2011. By then, Cheryl had become disillusioned with the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, believing it was either incompetent or uninterested in solving the case. Beginning in 2012, Mike's mother wrote about 1 letter a day to the governor, Rick Scott, asking him to either assign the investigation to another agency or appoint a special prosecutor to do so. Cheryl sent 2,600 letters to the governor over 9 years. In 2012, Denise caught Brian cheating and they broke up. The following year, Denise filed for divorce. After a few more years, an appraisal of the former family home was to take place, after which even property issues would no longer bind them. This event was a turning point in Mike's case. Brian didn't want a divorce. Denise didn't want to continue the relationship. They were constantly fighting, and the Williams investigation was poking fun at them. Brian would call Denise and she stopped returning his calls. He couldn't handle the stress level. On August 5, 2016, the day a real estate appraisal was due as part of a court order, Denise left her home to drive to work at Florida State University. While talking to her sister on the phone, she saw someone climb over the back seat of her car. It turned out to be Winchester. Ryan pressed a loaded gun against Denise's ribs and told her to drive straight ahead. He said he had to do that because she wasn't answering his calls. Denise tried to calm Brian down, agreed with everything he said, and promised to give him a chance to save their marriage. Brian believed it. Denise assured him that she wouldn't go to the police and report what he had just done, and Brian got out of the car. As he got out, he took the brown sheet, plastic sheeting, bleach sprayer, and tools with him. It became clear that Denise had miraculously escaped death. Denise called emergency services. Brian was quickly arrested and charged with kidnapping, which is a first-degree felony in Florida, and carries a life sentence as the maximum penalty. He was also charged with domestic violence and armed burglary. The court decided to keep Brian in custody without bail. Cheryl Williams expressed hope that this development will lead to the solving of her son's disappearance case. "Brian is not going to let Denise run around alone with all that money," she told the New York Daily News. "I pray that he will tell us what really happened." And Brian did tell, bargaining himself an extremely favorable deal with the prosecutor and avoiding a life sentence. "At first, I think we were all doing really well, but I wasn't a good husband," Brian began his story. "One day I found a note in my first wife Kathy's purse and realized she was cheating on me. I wanted revenge. We often went to bars and concerts with Denise and Mike. I had been friends with Denise since high school. I was never really attracted to her. But after Kathy cheated on me, I started looking at other women differently." The affair between Brian and Denise began in October 1997. One-time drunken sex at a rock concert quickly escalated to frequent secret meetings. "We started meeting at hotels. During the workday, we met whenever we had the opportunity." Brian recounted. He did not want a divorce. Denise made it clear that she would never divorce her husband. Public opinion was important to her, and she did not want to share custody of her daughter. Over time, the affair became more than just meeting for casual sex. Denise and Brian thought of themselves as a couple, exchanging gifts and love letters. It became clear that they couldn't go on like this. They could not be without each other, and divorce was unacceptable to Denise. Her pious image was not to be harmed. Around this time, Mike almost died in a hunting accident. Brian saved him, and Denise suddenly saw a way out of the situation. After the deal with the prosecutor, Brian will reveal, "The year 2000 prompted us to start talking about Mike and Kathy's death. Denise wanted it all on me, not her, and she wanted a scenario where it wasn't a murder but an accident. She wanted death to be left up to God. That way she could live with it." After considering various options, Brian and Denise settled on a boating accident. In doing so, they timed the murder so that they could get the maximum possible payout on Mike's life insurance policy. They both realized that Mike had to be killed before one of the 3 policies expired at the end of December 2000. The plan was in place. Brian called his friend to go hunting. He said he'd found a great spot on the shores of Lake Seminole. Mike expected to go there with Brian and return home by noon to celebrate his anniversary with his wife. "I told him that we were going to go to a special place and that he absolutely had to bring his wading boots with him. I had to make sure he took them with him because it was believed that if you fell overboard in wading boots, you would drown very quickly. The plan was to make death look like an accidental drowning. Once Brian and Mike were in the water, Brian pushed Mike out of the boat, but instead of sinking, he grabbed onto the stumps and began to wade through them to the shore. Brian panicked. "I didn't know what to do." Mike started calling loudly for help. "I didn't know how to get out of this situation. I had a shotgun. I was panicking and I shot him in the head. I didn't think about what I was doing. Things didn't go according to plan, and I needed to cover up what happened. There was hardly any time left. I should have been back home by now and getting ready to go hunting with my father-in-law. No one knew I was at the lake with Mike, so I decided it would be best for me to drive home and pretend like I had overslept. I drove home and hoped that Kathy was still asleep. I entered the house as quietly as I could. Katie was asleep. My phone was on the floor. I went to bed, called my father-in-law, and apologized." Brian did everything he could to create an alibi for himself. Then he hid the body. Denise didn't know that Brian had shot Mike in the head and buried him. Brian tried to tell her, but she didn't want to listen. It was enough for her that her husband was gone. Denise wanted to go on living with the idea that it was God who kept him from swimming out and let him drown. According to Brian, they promised each other that neither of them would ever say anything. Denise and Brian justified what happened by saying that the main reason Mike was killed was because it was impossible for them to live together. "We said the money was just the cherry on the cake," Brian would pronounce in court. Investigators learned that it was Brian who planted a hat, boots, flashlight, and license. First, he needed to keep searchers from leaving the lake, and afterwards he needed grounds to pronounce Mike dead so Denise could get insurance, since a recognition process usually takes about 5 years. The lovers managed it in just 7 months. Including Social Security and other benefits, Denise received about $2 million. On May 8, 2018, Denise Williams was charged with first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and accessory to a felony, which carried a life sentence. Denise pleaded not guilty to all 3 charges. In February 2019, she was sentenced to life in prison. 5 months later, Mike and Denise's daughter, Ansley, received all of her late father's assets and insurance money owed to Denise. In January 2020, Denise Williams appealed the conviction and life sentence. Her attorney argued before Florida's First District Court of Appeal that there was no evidence that she was involved in committing the murder. In November 2020, the murder conviction was overturned, but the 30-year sentence for conspiracy to commit murder was upheld. Denise is now in custody at the Florida Women's Reception Center. She will be 78 years old when she is released. Brian Winchester was transferred to Madison Correctional Institute in Florida to serve the remainder of his sentence. His current release date is set for July 30th, 2036. He will be 67 years old. Ansley, daughter of Mike and Denise, insists her mother is innocent and places the blame on Brian Winchester. She refused to speak to any media regarding the outcome of the case and her personal life. According to Cheryl and Nick, Ansley's uncle, they have not been able to connect with Ansley. Cheryl is very sorry that she has lost not only her son, but also her granddaughter. The story of a British woman named Dina Thompson, nicknamed the Black Widow, became, in the mid-20s, one of the main topics for numerous documentaries, TV shows, and crime programs. This pleasant at first glance woman turned out to be a pathological liar, fraudster, and led to the grave at least one man who loved her wholeheartedly. Dina repeatedly managed to escape punishment, but in 2003 she was still in the dock. Despite the fact that she was facing life imprisonment, the court was surprisingly mild, allowing parole. So in 2022, one of the most dangerous criminals, who miraculously survived her ex-husband characterized as pure evil, went free. Thompson's victims were always men, which according to experts, may indicate some kind of trauma received by the criminal in childhood or adolescence. However, Dina's early years were quite prosperous. The girl was born in 1960 in North London and brought up in a full family. Her parents lived modestly, but did everything to ensure that their daughter did not need anything. The head of the family worked as a prison guard, seriously engaged in sports, and from childhood motivated Dina to attend gyms, where she diligently engaged in gymnastics. In addition, the man often participated in all kinds of sports competitions, including those held in other countries, and constantly took his daughter with him. Dina grew up quite active, cheerful, and sociable child. She easily made acquaintances and friendships with peers, and with age learned to quickly win the attention of guys she liked. After school, the girl went to college, and then got a job in one of the local banks. At the age of 22 years, Dina met her future first spouse, Lee Wyatt. They first met thanks to the cousin of the guy, who organized a couple blind date. Between young people immediately burst feelings, and a stormy romance began. They got along well, spent a lot of time together, and 2 years later officially legalized their relationship. After the wedding, the couple moved to a provincial place called Yapton, with a population of only 3,000 people. Soon the couple had a son, and the new parents began to slowly develop their own business, creating Author's Soft Toys, the images of which they invented together. In parallel, Dina worked as a cashier in a construction organization, and their family, according to neighbors, was quite happy and prosperous. The head of the family was often away on business matters and was absent from home for long periods of time. With neighbors, the man practically did not communicate, but his wife, on the contrary, quickly made acquaintances with local residents. Dina knew how to win the favor of others, easily rubbed in the trust. In addition, men often paid attention to the attractive young woman and even tried to court her. At the dawn of the 90 AS, Dina met with a young journalist, whose name was Julian Webb. The man offered her to work as a model for advertising clothing and household appliances, and soon her pictures were painted on the pages of local newspapers and magazines. Dina was eager to pose and felt at ease in front of the camera. By then, Lee Wyatt hadn't been home for months, and none of the neighbors had any idea where he was or why he'd been gone so long. His wife, apparently, did not miss him too much, having had an affair with Julian. Just 3 months after meeting, the journalist introduced the chosen one to his parents, saying that he was going to marry her. Subsequently, Webb's mother recalled that she was quite surprised by such a hasty decision of her son. In addition, a potential daughter-in-law, who was a few years older than Julian, did not inspire her confidence. When the neighbors learned about the upcoming wedding, they were puzzled because they knew that Dina is already legally married to another man. However, her husband hadn't been home for months, and no one knew for sure where he was or what was wrong with him. As it later turned out, all this time, Lee was in the small town of New Quay, located almost on the other side of the country. There he lived under an assumed name and false documents, hiding, as he thought, from the mafia. In fact, the man became a victim of skillful lies of his wife, who convinced him that their family was in mortal danger, and escape, this is the only way out. The couple, as mentioned, were engaged in creating authors' soft toys, and their most successful creation was Leprechaun Sean, which sold well and gained a certain popularity. In early 1991, Dinah told her husband that their creation was interested in the corporation Disney and is ready to pay £50 million sterling for the opportunity to use this character. But the joy was short-lived, and soon the woman reported that representatives of the criminal world, having learned about the big deal, want to get most of the money, threatening otherwise to kill the whole family. Dina also came up with a way out of the situation, convincing her husband that he needed to hide. Lee quickly acquired fake documents and went on the run. But before this cunning woman persuaded Lee to write several threatening letters to her and make several similar records of phone calls, which allegedly were supposed to be proof that he hates his wife, so that the mafia to stop pursuing her. The trusting husband, not suspecting anything, did as his wife told him to do and then fled. In a foreign city with no home or friends, Lee was ready to take on any job, and all the money he earned was sent to his wife and son so that his family did not need anything. Most likely, this escape really saved his life, but the threat came not from fictional bandits, but from his own wife. In November of the same 1991, Dina married her new favorite Julian, and the wedding couple played on the very money that faithfully sent home deceived Lee. Webb was madly in love and happy, but soon after the wedding neighbors began to notice that the woman regularly visits the lovers while her husband at work. And after a while, she informed Julian that she was terminally ill and was fired from her job because of it. The story with a fatal diagnosis and dismissal turned out to be a lie from the first to the last word, and it also turned out that from the accounts of the company where Dina worked, a large amount of money was missing, and the main suspect in this crime was herself. Then the woman accused her first husband, Lee Wyatt, who allegedly forced her to go to the crime by threats. As evidence, she provided the very letters and audio recordings that she herself had previously convinced him to do. Wyatt himself returned home as soon as he learned that his spouse had remarried. The case was limited to a scandal, and although Dina claimed that he had beaten her, there was no evidence of this. Nevertheless, the detectives sided with the woman, so Lee again had to leave Yapton in a hurry. In love, Julian's situation did not embarrass at all, and he gave his wife all his savings for the treatment of fictitious her fatal disease. But time passed, the money melted, and the husband began to wonder how the treatment is progressing. It turned out that the woman did not have a single medical document confirming her diagnosis. Relationships in the family broke down. Neighbors heard how the spouses fought loudly, and in June 1994, the day after celebrating Julian's 31st birthday, he died suddenly. The evening before the tragedy, his mother called him, but Dina reported that her husband wasn't feeling well and couldn't answer. Julian's mother asked her sister-in-law to call an ambulance, but she ignored her request. The expert examination showed that the young man died of a drug overdose, but for some reason no one saw a criminal trace in this tragedy, and his wife insisted that her husband voluntarily decided to kill himself. In addition, she demanded that Julian's body was cremated, but his parents were strongly opposed to this. Also, after the death of her husband, Dina tried to get a large insurance payment, but she was denied because their marriage was recognized as invalid. At the funeral, Dina did not even try to cry or depict grief. On the contrary, she chose a frank outfit and behaved defiantly. Almost immediately afterward, the widowed woman began to spin numerous novels and affairs. She openly brought lovers to her house, not hiding from the neighbors. Only in 1997, Dina filed a divorce from her first legal husband, and less than a year later she met Richard Thompson, who immediately managed to charm. Dina, not thinking long, told the new lover that suffers from a serious illness, and she has to live a very short time. Blinded by love, the man said that he would turn the last months of her life into a fairy tale and is ready to spend all his savings for this. Wedding couple played in one of the best hotels in Florida. There they spent their honeymoon and then returned to their native England, settling on its southern coast in the city of Brighton. According to Richard's memories, his wife literally bewitched him with her care and support, and she also skillfully pretended to share all his views and aspirations. He has always dreamed of owning his own boat to professionally engage in fishing, and his wife not only approved this idea, but also offered him to open a company that provides a yacht for rent so that he could not only fish himself, but also to teach it to others. Less than a year after the wedding, during a New Year's Eve celebration, Dina gave her husband a romantic dinner. They took a bath together, and afterward, she said she had prepared a special gift and asked her husband's permission to tie him up. Richard, not suspecting anything wrong, readily agreed. But as soon as he had the ropes on his hands, a blindfold over his eyes, and a gag in his mouth, he was suddenly struck hard on the head with a bat, followed by another. Luckily, Richard not only did not lose consciousness, but managed to free himself quickly. Then Dina grabbed a knife and wounded her husband in the shoulder. Richard knocked the weapon out of his wife's hands, immobilized her, and called the police. Dina burst into tears, admitted that all this time she had lied to him and spent all his money. However, already at the station, she pulled herself together and began to claim that it was her husband who attacked her, and she was only defending herself. The story did not end there, and a day later, a real estate agent came to Richard's house to sell the house. He had an appointment with the landlady, who warned him that her husband had left for America on a business trip. At that moment, Richard realized that his wife was planning to kill him, sell the house, and run away with the money. No one would look for Thompson himself for a long time, thinking that he had gone across the ocean. In the course of court proceedings, it turned out that the woman had withdrawn all the money from her husband's bank accounts, forging his signature, and also used his credit cards, accumulating a lot of debts. The case gained a wide resonance, and other men began to apply to the police, former lovers of Dina, whom she deceived and cleaned to the thread, telling about a fictitious, incurable disease. Then also remembered, and the first husband of the woman who had to hide for many years, first from her fictitious pursuers from the mafia, and then from the police. It was finally revealed that it was Dina who stole the company in which he worked, accusing her husband of everything. However, the jury, despite the presence of irrefutable evidence, acquitted the woman in the case of the attack on her husband, Richard Thompson, and Richard himself was accused of seeking to attract attention to himself, making up such a story. Nevertheless, Dina was found guilty of numerous financial frauds and sentenced to nearly 4 years in prison. The hype around Dina Thompson also reminded about the strange, sudden death of her second husband, journalist Julian Webb. The woman herself told completely different versions and circumstances of his death. She said that her husband was poisoned by steroids, which he took to keep himself in shape, then claimed that he drank a lot and fell asleep in the sun, getting sunstroke, and at the inquest, and in general, said that he took his own life. Despite her caution, Dina once confessed to her best friend that she had poisoned her husband by putting potent drugs in a spicy dish that he adored. The police managed to track down the owner of the diner where Julian often dined and ordered food to take home. He recalled that the day before the tragedy, Webb's wife took out rice and chicken curry. And then the investigators guessed that it was this seasoning that interrupted the specific flavor of the drugs. In connection with the newly discovered circumstances, a new investigation was initiated, and Julian's body was exhumed and sent for examination. As it turned out, the man was poisoned by a large dose of powerful antidepressants added to his favorite dish with curry, and strengthened their effect, aspirin, which Dina dissolved in her husband's drink. At the time of the call to his mother, Webb was still alive, and he could be saved, but it was not part of the plans of his wife. In 2003, the Black Widow was finally brought to trial. The investigator at the hearing characterized her as the most dangerous woman he had ever had to deal with, and the judge noted that she was a skilled and very dodgy liar. Dina Thompson was sentenced to life in prison, but with parole eligibility after 16 years. The story of the crimes of the Black Widow formed the basis of numerous documentary detectives actively discussed in TV shows and used in the press. Even after Dina was behind bars, detectives unearthed another dark story from her past. As it turned out, one of her first lovers disappeared without a trace, and to this day has not been found alive or dead. The young man's name was Stoyan Kostov, and he lived in Bulgaria, where Dina herself trained as a gymnast in the late 70s. Between them began a romantic relationship, and afterwards, the guy disappeared forever. The investigation does not exclude that Dina is directly related to this case, and Kostov became one of her first victims, but it was not possible to prove anything. While serving her sentence, Thompson worked with a prison psychologist and underwent rehabilitation courses. Despite her exemplary behavior and the right words about re-education and realization of her mistakes, Dina, according to the detective in charge of her case, does not feel remorse and pangs of conscience, and therefore can re-offend. Nevertheless, in the summer of 2022, the 61-year-old Black Widow was released from prison. After learning about it, Richard Thompson said that now he will not feel safe because he does not know what to expect from his former spouse. Now, Dina is obliged to report to the police about all her connections and relationships, observe curfew, and report on all financial transactions. She is also forbidden to approach her ex-husbands and lovers affected by her actions. She is forced to wear a special tracking bracelet on her leg that records all her movements. A few months after her release, Thompson was captured by journalists while returning from a store with shopping in a large bag. January 1999. David and Belinda Temple were expecting their second child. Belinda was due to give birth as soon as possible. The doctors predicted labor in a couple of weeks. Like all pregnant women, Belinda was tired very much and quickly, and she still had her son Evan, who also required attention and care. That day, David decided to relieve his wife from household chores and gave her some time for an evening rest. And so that she would not be distracted by anything, he and his son went for a walk in the park. Father and son were having fun. Walking in the fresh air quickly tires and whets the appetite, so after the walk, they went to a cafe to eat a sandwich and drink a Coke. After the cafe, they drove home. David parked the car and noticed that the front door of his house had broken glass. "Evan, I'm going to take you to visit Harlan for a bit, okay?" said David, and without waiting for an answer from his son, quickly led him across the street to a neighboring house where family friends lived. "Why can't we go to Mom's?" asked the son, who could barely keep up with his father. "Mom's in the hospital right now." David couldn't think of anything else to say. Quentin Harlan had barely opened the door to the unexpected guests, and not even had time to say hello before David took his son into the living room without speaking and ran toward his house. Quentin, not understanding anything, shouted to his wife to look after the child, and himself ran after his silent friend. "What's the matter?" Quentin shouted. But when he saw the broken front door of Temple's dwelling, he realized that David probably didn't know what was waiting for him inside. The house was a mess. All the closets were open, things were scattered on the floor, and worst of all, there were trails of blood on the floor that led to the stairs. Quentin pushed David aside and saw that under the stairs, in the dressing room, Belinda was lying belly down with her arms spread apart and a huge hole in the back of her head. David, apparently out of shock, did not even cry out, did not utter a word, did not rush to his wife's body, but immediately took out his cell phone and dialed the police number. The operator on the other end of the line didn't anticipate the brutality of the murder, so he asked David to check Belinda's pulse and even give her CPR. "What the hell kind of CPR are you talking about? Her head is splattered all over the walls." Police officers immediately rushed to the scene, except they didn't get inside the house for a long time. The Temple family's bull terrier, named Shaq, growled and barked at the unfamiliar uniformed men and seemed about ready to lunge at the police officers. One of the officers even drew his service pistol as David, who had come out of the house, yelled for them to put their guns away and hurriedly took the aggressive dog into the garage. Once inside the house where the tragedy had recently occurred, the police looked around and concluded that the burglars were at work here, who did not know that the mistress was in the house at that moment, and even though she was pregnant, they had no choice but to shoot her and thus get rid of the witness. 1986. Belinda gets a college education in her hometown. Even though her twin sister Brenda left to study at Steve Austin University, Belinda stayed with her parents because in high school, she started dating Marshall Kelmy, who was 3 years older than her and whom she was just crazy about. Her father and mother were against this relationship, at least because of her boyfriend, their daughter would not be able to get a prestigious education and, as it usually happens, would get pregnant early and end up dropping out of even a community college. On this topic, there were many scandals in their home. Carol's mother did not allow her daughter to start a joint life with Marshall and dropped then such a phrase, "He is nobody to you. When you get married, you can move out anywhere, but until then, you have your own house." Belinda was a stubborn girl who always got her way, and she must have taken her mother's words as a wake-up call. Sometime later, at a family dinner, to which Marshall had been invited, despite the inhibitions, the young couple announced that they were to be married. There was a heavy silence at the table. "Well, now that they've decided," Mom gritted her teeth, and they spent the rest of the evening in complete silence. Belinda had actually made the decision herself, wanting to show her parents that she was an adult and capable of making her own decisions. Her boyfriend was not particularly eager for an official marriage, but did not refuse the proposal of his girlfriend, whether he did not want to offend or for some other reason. The two young people got married. No, there was no grand celebration. Belinda wore her sister's white dress, called a few friends, and she and Marshall signed, and then just walked around the city, drinking champagne and having fun. The very next day, Belinda packed her things and moved in with her husband, who at that time still lived with his parents and rent a separate place was not even planned. Official marriage, in fact, did not affect their relationship, and as already mentioned, Belinda did it all just to stop hearing motherly reproaches and become independent. But the taste of this life turned out to be very bitter. Not 6 months later, Marshall began to spend little time at home, saying he was working late, but was actually with another woman. Belinda found out when she noticed that her husband was acting strangely. One day she waited until his workday was over and followed her husband, and that's when it all came to light. Marshall was walking hand in hand with some strange woman, most likely with his colleague. The deceived wife did not organize any fights and jealousy scenes, but simply packed her things and returned to her mother. The guilty Marshall hung around the doorstep of her house for a long time, often calling on the phone, trying to beg her forgiveness, but Belinda was unshakable and too proud to forgive the young man. They were soon divorced. 1998. Belinda is already pregnant with her second child, but still works part-time at the school. The children listen to her half-heartedly, respect her for her fairness, and even a little afraid. Belinda herself is worried that because of her pregnancy, she will miss the basketball competition between schools, and she will not be able to prepare the team well, because her colleague, Richard Bachman, does not care about her team and children in general. He has confessed to her so many times that if he had another job, he would have given up being a teacher long ago. Belinda disliked this attitude and could not understand how this flabby and fat 40-year-old man was still in his position. Belinda was not one of those teachers who turned a blind eye to student absenteeism. So when she noticed that one of her students, high school senior Riley Joe Sanders, had been absent from class for months, she immediately reached out to her colleagues. She wanted to know if this was her problem as a teacher or if the boy was a systematic truant. Her colleagues answered that it was not her problem. The boy was brought up in a bad family. No one cared about him, and he appeared at school only rarely. Belinda couldn't leave it at that. That same evening, she visited his mother, who lived nearby, and had a serious talk with her, which later bore fruit. However, it wasn't quite what the young teacher had expected. Riley Joe Sanders came to class. practiced on an equal footing with the other students. But during a basketball game, when Sanders pushed his opponent and Belinda pointed out Riley's disgusting behavior, he insulted her with the last words and even said something like, "You'll answer to me for this. You better look around, especially in the evenings." 1987. After breaking up with Marshall, Belinda had nothing left to hold on to in her hometown. So she followed her sister to Stephen F. Austin State University. She loved her time at the university. It seems that she truly found her calling. In addition to studying, she works part-time as a basketball coach, and the young woman had high expectations. At the same university, she meets David Temple. He, like Belinda, is a part-time coach, but for soccer, and also plays for the university team as team captain. Soccer for David was an integral part of life. He practiced it since childhood, and even then it was clear that he would become a star. At school, he always successfully played for his team, for which he was respected by all teachers, even though David had a difficult character. He could easily insult anyone or even beat up, but he got away with it all. Being on the field during the game, he would start with half a turn, and then could not calm down for a very long time. Later, however, one of the players on his team said that David's aggressiveness is due to the fact that he takes steroids. With Belinda, David behaved completely differently, turned into a caring guy who literally could carry his queen in his arms. With one amendment, as soon as someone smiled in the direction of his beloved, as David immediately turned on and tried to clarify the relationship on the fists. Belinda also came to the taste, and David's parents, they literally idolized her. They really liked that she, as well as their son, crazy about sports, which means they have a lot in common. But her twin sister, and in principle Belinda's friends, from this union were, to put it mildly, not thrilled. The whole point is that before meeting David, they knew Belinda as a strong-willed and independent personality, and in this relationship she changed a lot, became constrained, quiet, humble. It seemed that her whole life was built around pleasing David. In addition to all of this, being in this toxic relationship, Belinda became distant from her family. Calls to her parents became less and less frequent, and trips home, whether for vacations or weekends, stopped altogether. Who in the family could like this? Closer to graduation, the couple got themselves a bull terrier and named their pet, Shaq. And after receiving their long-awaited diplomas, David and Belinda got married. 1999. The police began to examine the crime scene. How could the burglar get into a house guarded by such a vicious dog? In fact, how could the perpetrator distract the bull terrier that prevented the police from making a step into the Temple yard? Then they turned their attention to the front door. The glass was broken, as if the perpetrator had tried to open the lock from the inside, but in that case, the shards of glass would have been near the threshold. But here they were in the distance, to the right of the entrance. So the glass was broken when the door was unlocked. Why would they do that? In the living room, there was a box on a nightstand, with a toppled TV lying on the floor beside it. The policeman opened it. Inside lay earrings, rings, a chain, in appearance resembling gold. Also not clear why the robber did not touch the jewelry. With each new minute spent inside the Temple family home, the police officers came more and more to the conclusion that everything that had happened inside resembled a dramatization. They knew from experience that in a robbery, the criminal takes absolutely everything he can find and carry away. And here, as it seems, nothing was even taken. And then there was that dog that wouldn't leave their minds. Something was clearly wrong here. As for the murder, the shot was fired in the back of the head, presumably with a 12-gauge shotgun, while the victim was kneeling with his back to the killer. That said, a shotgun is not considered a popular weapon among robbers. It's very difficult to carry or transport and still not be seen. In Belinda's case, the murder was absolutely 4 o'clock in the afternoon. A criminal wouldn't be walking around with a shotgun in broad daylight. "David, do you keep any weapons at home?" "Yeah, I have a couple of rifles." David showed his weapons to the police officers, but the shotgun that could have killed Belinda was not among them. The cops asked David to ride with them to the station to give a statement and take an inventory of the stolen items. The man was very nervous, but nevertheless went with the police officers. His son Evan, who did not yet know what had happened, stayed at Harlan's house. 1996. David Temple and Quentin Harlan, in addition to being neighbors, worked at the same school. You could say that they were real friends. They often met outside of work hours to watch games on TV together or have a family barbecue. One day, David and Quentin were brought together by something else besides their love of sports. There was a new young teacher at the school, Heather Scott. Quentin immediately paid attention to her, gave all sorts of signs of attention, and one day even invited her to an evening dinner, but Heather refused him. It so happened that Quentin had a rival, and this rival, surprisingly, turned out to be David. Quentin was beyond angry and resentful that his married friend, who even has a son, was building a secret relationship at work. You have to hand it to Quentin. He was a good friend and could keep a secret. Heather did not even suspect about David's marital status, since he did not wear a wedding ring and did not tell anything about his real life. Moreover, outside the walls of the school, David and Heather behaved like a happy couple, and it was noticed by the whole teaching staff of the school. Belinda knew nothing about David's second life. Once she talked to Quentin and revealed to him that she suspected her husband of cheating, but Quentin, of course, dissuaded the suffering wife. You have a vivid imagination. David is your husband and a great family man. How could you think such a thing? And there was much to think about. If David had previously been extremely reverent towards Belinda, now he could afford to insult his wife even in front of other people, such as, for example, he often called her fat, although after childbirth she only a little weight gain. Asked to go to another room when there were guests in the house, as if she scares them with her untidy appearance, and so on. Belinda, instead of having a serious talk with her husband on the subject, accepted this attitude toward herself, but cried at night and felt deeply unhappy as a woman. In parallel, all the while, David was enjoying his new relationship with Heather. 1999. The police suspected David, but they couldn't prove anything. But flipping through the case files of burglaries in the neighborhood, they learned that 8 days before the murder at the Temple house, a house on the next street had been burglarized, and the perpetrator was Riley Joe Sanders. Yes, the same persistent truant from the school where Belinda taught and who had threatened her. He was immediately called in for questioning. Riley had no alibi on the day of the murder, and besides, his father had a shotgun, just a 12-gauge. But when they searched the Sanders house, no weapon was found. When the high school student realized that the police had every reason to detain him, he confessed that on the day of the murder of the teacher, he was with friends, and hid it only because he was with a large group of people smoking pot and did not want to frame others with his testimony. The charge against Riley was dropped. 1998. Because of a new relationship with a coworker, David became further and further estranged from his family. His psychological pressure on his wife grew steadily. He never once raised his hand at her, but all their communication consisted only of insults. It was during this year that Belinda learned that she was pregnant again. This news made her forget about all the past offenses against David, and she felt over the moon. David seemed to be trying to act like a happy father too, but it wasn't working. Sometimes David did not even come home at night, and Belinda was afraid to ask what was the reason for his absence at night, because her husband could get very angry and make a real scandal. A pregnant woman did not want that. Belinda often asked David to help her prepare for the birth of the baby, to go to the store for things, to make repairs in the new children's room, to install shelves on the walls. David ignored all of his wife's requests, and Belinda, although she was in a position, began to do everything on her own, to go shopping, paint the walls, assemble the purchased furniture. David made no effort at all. Christmas was coming. Belinda was already 8 months pregnant. She decided to discuss with her husband what they would give each other, but David suggested that they should not give gifts together this year, and that the money saved would be better spent on the baby that was about to be born, especially since the doctors had warned the expectant mother that she might go into premature labor and the baby might be born before the new year. Christmas came. Although the spouses had agreed not to give each other anything, David never gave Belinda anything, not even a nice little thing. Moreover, he suddenly packed his things and said that all the New Year's holidays will spend with friends on the hunt. Belinda told her sister about it, and she dropped all her plans to come to her so that Belinda would not feel abandoned. and as the doctors warned, labor could begin at any moment. David, of course, wasn't on any hunting trips with his friends. He spent the holidays with Heather, whose neck was decorated with a gold necklace, a gift from Temple for Christmas. 2007. It seemed that David Temple has almost forgotten about the murder of his wife, as if in his life no Belinda Temple had never been. He did not care about the fact that from the moment of the murder has passed 5 years and the culprit has not been found. He married Heather in 2001, and the two of them raised Evan, but back in 2004. In November, there was a knock on his door. On the doorstep stood police officers who, handcuffing David, informed him that he was being held on suspicion of the murder of Belinda Temple. David, as before, denied everything. David's trial did not begin until 2007. According to the investigation, the motive for the crime was his new love affair with Heather. Interviewed colleagues of David said that more than once during Belinda's pregnancy, heard him bragging about how he easily exchanged his fat and pregnant wife for a young and beautiful Heather. According to the prosecution's version, David killed Belinda immediately after she came home from work because the young woman was found in her work uniform and work shoes. He then initiated the robbery by throwing things around the house and quickly drove to the park with his son, which provided an alibi. The prosecution also added such facts that nothing was stolen from the house, and there was a vicious dog in the yard that would not let any stranger into the house. The murder weapon was probably dropped by David in the rice paddy, as there were witnesses who saw David's car stopped near the paddy and only Evan was in the car at the time. However, the shotgun was never recovered in that area. Heather's testimony was that before the murder of Belinda, their relationship with David was not considered serious, and she did not even love him. These words Temple certainly did not like and introduced confusion into the jury's decision. Could David kill his wife for the sake of a non-serious relationship, or Heather is lying, trying to save her husband in this way? In November 2007, David was sentenced to life in prison. 2009. A friend of Riley Sanders goes to the police to clear his conscience. From his words then, a few years ago, Riley told him how he took his father's shotgun with the intention of robbing the Temple family home, and thereby teaching his teacher a lesson about his mother's truancy at school. And he really almost managed to enter the house. But at that moment, a bull terrier ran out of the garage, and Riley shot at the dog, but did not hit, and afraid that the sound of shotgun fire would attract the neighbors, quickly ran away from there. This testimony was submitted to the court. A review of the case began. In the meantime, David was released from prison on bail. Heather had no intention of being the wife of a man who had spent so much time in jail and was not sure how much longer he would spend in jail. She filed for divorce. It took the jury a long time to decide what kind of punishment David deserved. It was when Temple was free, and the court had not yet decided his sentence that the pandemic began. It wasn't until 2023 that the case was revisited. David was found guilty after all. He was sentenced to life in prison with parole after 17 years. His son Evan, while the trial was going on until the last moment, did not believe that his father was capable of such a cold-blooded murder, and throughout the trial, supported him to the last moment. The tragic story of the Rose family is considered one of the most bizarre and confusing crimes committed in America in recent years. This case struck investigators not only by its cynicism and cruelty, but also by the fact that the victims and the alleged perpetrators were close relatives. Despite the fact that many years have passed since the crime was committed, and the perpetrator has long served his harsh sentence behind bars, there are still many questions and white spots in this story. Many still do not believe in the fairness of the court's verdict. Now let's get down to business. It was an ordinary average family living in a provincial suburb of Bristol in the state of Tennessee and had never been on the radar of law enforcers before. The family was headed by elderly couple Curtis and Lena Maria Rose, who had lived together for over 40 years. They had 2 grown daughters and 6 grandchildren, but we will only look at those family members who were directly involved in this high-profile case. So, at the time of the crime in the house and the surrounding area were the elderly owners themselves, Curtis and Lena Maria Rose, their eldest daughter, 39-year-old Tosha Milhorn with her husband James and 6 children. 2 of the children were Tosha and James's shared children, while the other 3 children were their heirs from a previous relationship. Also present in the house was a neighborhood girl who stopped by to play with them. It is worth noting that Tosha and James and their children lived at Tosha's parents' house for about 2 months, as their own home was undergoing renovations at the time. Later, another key player in those events, 19-year-old Seth Denton, arrived at the house. He was Toshi's eldest son, but his relationship with his mother and stepfather was strained, to put it mildly, and they avoided communicating with each other in every possible way, and their last meeting ended in tragedy. According to neighbors, the Rose couple was quite happy and prosperous. Their daughter Tosha was also happily married to James, who worked as an auto mechanic and was fond of restoring vintage cars. It was the Rose couple's family home that was the scene of the carnage. Police officers who arrived on the call later dubbed it the worst crime scene they had ever seen and the bloodiest in the history of their quiet county. The bodies of 2 women, Lena Maria and Tosha, a mother and daughter, were found in the house, shot almost point blank. Tosha was in a chair at the dining room table, and her mother was lying on the floor between the table and the refrigerator. Also lying on the doorstep of the house was the critically wounded James, Tosha's husband, who was quickly rushed to the hospital, but despite the efforts of the doctors, the man soon died of extensive internal injuries and massive blood loss. None of the children in the house were injured. It is likely that they were not targeted by the shooter, or were simply not in his field of vision at the time of the massacre of the adults. Almost immediately after the crime, the police received 2 phone calls, one after the other. The first call came from the owner of the house, Curtis Rose, who said that his eldest grandson Seth had committed a shooting in the house and then fled the scene. But soon there was a call from Seth himself, who told a different version of what happened and blamed everything on his grandfather Curtis. In addition, it turned out that Seth was wounded in the arm and shot him Curtis. However, he did not deny it, saying that he was trying to detain his grandson and not let him escape from the scene of the massacre. The alleged killer, Seth Denton, was arrested in the hospital, where he sought medical help in connection with the wound. Then the investigation was to restore the chain of tragic events and find out what really happened in the house of the Rose family. Surprisingly, but for the basis of the investigation was taken only one version, and the second version was taken seriously only a few years later. She naively believed that this would happen again, and loved ones and colleagues did not even guess that her spouse raised his hand on her. However, a year later, the story repeated itself, and Adrian again beat his wife. This time, Samantha decided that it was the last straw. In addition, her husband's constant temper tantrums and his manic desire to control her every move were driving Samantha crazy. She wrote a statement to the police, reporting that she was beaten by her husband, then took the children and moved to the house of her parents. In the spring of 2017, the spouses officially divorced, and their family home, by court order, got Samantha and the children, and soon they returned there. However, Adrian did not plan to leave his ex-wife alone at all, and continued to pursue her, poisoning her life. The young woman did not feel safe, and was in constant fear. Fearing for her own life and the lives of her children, she obtained a court injunction to prevent her ex-husband from approaching them and trying to interfere in any way in their affairs. But this did not stop Basham. He settled nearby, trying in every way to annoy Samantha. According to a friend of Edrin, he promised to take away from his ex-wife everything that is dear to her, starting from the house and ending with children, as well as openly threatened physical violence against her. Shortly before the tragedy, the man again told his friend that Samantha would soon pay for everything. At the same time, he looked threatening, but the friend did not take these words seriously until he learned of the woman's death. Living in constant fear and nervous tension, Samantha equipped her home with an alarm system, installed bars on her windows, and placed surveillance cameras outside her home. She admitted that she was afraid that her ex-husband might break into her home and harm her or the children in some way. About a year after the divorce, Samantha began to feel that her ex-husband had calmed down and cooled down a bit. He became less frequent in her sight, which gave her the illusion of safety. Samantha even began to have an affair and began to make plans for a new happy life. On July 22, 2018, Fraser celebrated her 38th birthday in the company of close friends and a beloved man named Wayne. According to the memories of those who shared this holiday with her, she looked happy and was quite calm for herself and her loved ones. A few days before, the new chosen one had proposed to the woman, and after the wedding, they planned to take a long vacation and travel to distract themselves and forget about problems. The next morning, Samantha took the children to school and was on her way to work when she received a phone call from someone she knew, warning her that Adrian was in the neighborhood of her home. Samantha was concerned about this, but decided not to panic, just to be more cautious. She was due to face her ex-husband in court in a domestic violence case in a couple weeks, and she feared that he might somehow retaliate against her for the lawsuit. The woman shared her worries with her best friend in a phone conversation, but the latter reassured her. After that conversation, Samantha was never seen alive again. When Samantha did not come to school that day to pick up her children, the teacher, who knew about the difficult situation in their family, decided to call the police. The law enforcers immediately went to their home to check everything, and at first the situation looked as if the mistress had not yet returned. But when the officers of the law decided to check the garage adjacent to the house, before them opened a terrible picture. The body of the 38-year-old homeowner was hanging from the garage door fixture, and on the whole, the picture might have looked like the young woman had taken her own life. But Samantha's appearance was as if she had been run over by a truck. There was literally not a living spot on Samantha, and the hair on her head was wet and falling over her face, covering it. She wasn't wearing the same clothes she had left the house in that morning, and her shoes were missing altogether. It was obvious that someone else had been in the garage, and that someone had tried to make it look like Samantha had voluntarily passed away, but had made a lot of mistakes. For example, there was an overturned stepladder lying next to the body, but the rope was so long that the woman's feet were touching the floor. With age, this feeling turned into hatred, about which Seth often told friends and relatives. After graduating from school, the guy decided to go to serve in the army, and a year later, returning home, he again settled at his grandparents'. However, soon the young man decided that he wanted to start an independent life and moved to the city, where he rented a small apartment with his friend. He got a job at one of the local fast food restaurants, but shortly before the tragedy, the guy was fired. Family and friends spoke positively about Seth, noting that he never had any violent tendencies, did not run with bad companies, and never broke the law. But despite the positive characteristics, detectives considered that the main motive of the crime was Seth's unpleasant feelings towards his mother and her current spouse. According to the investigation, the events of that day developed as follows. Around 5 p.m., Seth drove his car to the house of his grandparents. He was wearing a camouflage jacket, and in the car lay a semi-automatic rifle. He left the car by the roadside, and with the weapon in hand, he went to the house, entering through the back door. Seth then fired several shots, killing his mother, grandmother, and severely wounding his stepfather, before leaving the jacket and rifle by the back door and going to his grandfather's house and asking him to call the police. The order in which the shots were fired was never determined because Seth completely denied his guilt. In addition, it was unclear why he asked his grandfather to call the police rather than fleeing immediately from the scene of the crime. It is assumed that his main target were his mother and stepfather, and the guy killed his grandmother as an unnecessary witness. As the main evidence proving Seth's guilt, the case included his jacket and rifle, found on the threshold at the back door of the house, traces of blood on his shoes, as well as bullets found in his car. Remarkably, about 100 rounds of ammunition in total were found, but no one questioned why he needed so many if he only planned to kill 2 people. Another oddity was the timing. According to the grandfather, after he and his grandson entered the house, where the terrible picture opened before his eyes, Seth hurriedly left the scene. Curtis himself found and took the children to safety, called the police, pulled out the gun he kept, and after all this, managed to catch up with his grandson and shot him twice. It was not until 2016 that the young man presented his version of what happened in court, which no one had previously considered for some reason. According to Seth, he has always been very close to his grandparents who raised him, but meetings with his mother he avoided by all means. As a teenager, he often went to shooting ranges with his grandfather, and it was his grandfather who encouraged him to join the army. On that fateful day, Seth called his maternal aunt Amanda, his mother's younger sister, and said he was going to visit his grandparents but didn't want to meet his mother there. The woman did not know that Tosha and her husband were visiting her parents, so she assured Seth that he could go without fear of crossing paths with his mother and stepfather. Amanda confirmed that information in court, noting that her nephew couldn't have known that Tosha and James were at Rose's house. Seth had hoped that he and his grandfather would go to the shooting range, and that was the reason he had brought a rifle with so many rounds of ammunition. He drove up to the house, got the gun, and went straight to the trailer where Grandpa usually worked. There, his grandson showed him his rifle, and they had a little discussion about it. Curtis then headed for the house without letting go of the rifle, and his grandson followed him. Seth knew that his grandfather had a gun and expected him to follow him, and afterward, according to Seth's lawyers, Curtis may have had a temporary insanity, during which he killed members of his family. But this version seemed untenable, so it was not considered initially and marked in court, although on the clothes and shoes of an elderly man also had traces of blood of the victims. He, for some reason from the very beginning, was not even included in the number of suspects. The young man in the dock was facing the capital punishment of death for the premeditated triple murder of his family members. His grandfather had been a key witness in the case from the beginning, and despite the fact that he had openly stated that he was prepared to kill his grandson that day, the court found such behavior justified. Curtis Rose was not taken to the station or questioned as a suspect, and his version of the events of that day was accepted as the only true one. In addition, many details and inconsistencies were simply overlooked, and Seth's version was not even considered until a year and a half after the crime. Most of the physical evidence did confirm Curtis's words, but what was out of the picture was somehow ignored by the investigation. The main argument in court was that Mr. Rose had no obvious motive for killing his wife, daughter, and son-in-law. The version of temporary insanity seemed far-fetched and untenable. The trial lasted more than a week, during which time nearly 200 pieces of evidence were presented and dozens of witnesses, including neighbors, relatives, and family friends, were heard. The grandfather and grandson's testimony completely contradicted each other, and it was obvious that one of them was lying. The jury deliberated for several days. They admitted to being severely exhausted emotionally and physically, but when it came to a verdict, they unanimously stated that they had no doubt that the defendant was guilty of each of the counts charged. Thus, Seth Denton was found guilty of triple murder, but after a detailed review of all the evidence and circumstances of the tragedy, the court decided to exclude the death penalty from the possible punishments, changing the sentence to life imprisonment. At the western end of Algoa Bay, stretching along the southeastern coast of South Africa, 400 miles from Cape Town, is the city of Port Elizabeth. In addition to being a major seaport, it is also the sixth most populous city in South Africa. It is in this city, in November 2004, 18-year-old Chris Panayiotou graduated from high school and joined the trading corporation of his father, who owned a fairly large network of stores and eateries in the city and its surroundings. Chris had a desire to be involved in his father's business from a young age and developed an interest in the specifics of managing retail chains and how to develop the retail services industry. He possessed amazing energy and determination. His dreams extended far beyond being an executive and skillful employee under his father's supervision. He dreamed of owning his own fish restaurant, somewhere near a 5-star hotel along Marina Drive and a large supermarket right by downtown Kings Beach. That afternoon, he was helping his father at a small diner on Market Street. The establishment's one-story-old building lacked square footage and glamour, but it was nonetheless popular with the neighborhood's youth. Here, Chris Panayiotou met his high school friend who invited him to a Friday night party organized by mutual friends at Barty's Tavern, located on the beach, and a constant success among young people. On Friday, sitting in a wicker bamboo chair and sipping beer from the establishment's specialty mug, Chris noticed a pretty young girl sitting alone at the bar, drinking lemonade from a tall glass. The young man left his seat and walked over to meet her. Her name was J.D. Dinks, and she had just turned 18 years old as well. A spark immediately ran between them. The young people found many common interests very quickly. After that party, Chris and J.D. began dating, not even realizing that their Friday night meeting at Barney's Tavern would be the prelude to a horrible love triangle story that would lead to a tragic death. J.D. was a girl with a cheerful and sweet personality. Her endless thirst for giving joy and warmth to others inspired her to devote herself to teaching. In 2005, she enrolled in university. While J.D. focused on her studies, Chris started his own business with tenacity and entrepreneurial spirit. The first business was a local grocery store, then a neighborhood restaurant and a cocktail bar, which Chris named Infinite. Despite the young people's busyness, the feelings that bonded J.D. and Chris grew stronger. It was a period when their relationship was growing stronger, like the roots of a young tree penetrating deeper into the soil. Both J.D. and Chris created their own little corner of happiness, where kindness and love seemed eternal, and days were filled with smiles and hope for an endlessly joyful future. However, over time, the lovers began to have problems in their relationship, or rather, one female problem. At first, Chanel Kutis was an employee of the store. She maintained with her employer, Chris Panayiotou, only business relations. But everything changed after a year. Among the office corridors and long store windows, secret love between Chris and his employee, Chanel Kutis, blossomed imperceptibly, and this woman became not just an employee of the store, but also Chris's lover. All, of course, carefully concealed. But employees, working next to this couple, could not help but notice the delicate hints of their affection for each other. Glances, enigmatic smiles, and gentle gestures left behind an aura of mystery and some hint. The lovers met secretly at night in local cozy hotels, and when J.D. was away, Chris even brought Chanel to his home. By this time, in the eyes of family and friends, J.D. and Chris looked like an established young couple. They were very well suited for each other and seemed successful and promising. J.D. had graduated from university and got a job at an elementary school on Nelson Mandela Bay, and Chris's business was doing well. Finally, they were officially engaged and began living together. Nevertheless, Chris's connection with Chanel continued. Chris's father, Costa Panayiotou, was terribly upset on the one hand and furious on the other with the unexpected news of his son's secret affair with a sales clerk. He could not understand how Chris, dating the intelligent, kind, and decent J.D. for 8 years, on the eve of the wedding, could behave so immorally. Costa found his son at Infinite celebrating his engagement with friends. That's where the heated conversation took place. Costa promised to disinherit Chris if he continued to date Chanel. Chris vowed to his father that he would leave Chanel, but in fact, continued his affair with Kutis. All this time, J.D. had no idea about her fiancé's affairs on the side. Therefore, Chris and J.D. were safely married in 2012. Soon, J.D. received an invitation to work at Rebecca College. Chris, spending serious money to support 2 women, gave his business its first blow. His finances dropped significantly. Expensive gifts to his mistress, spending on fancy hotel rooms, and treats all did not add to the profitability of the business. Over the next 3 years, Chris became increasingly estranged from his wife, continuing his affair on the side, thus destroying his business and family. J.D. felt that there was loneliness in her life and that Chris had her on the back burner, with no time to pay attention to her. The young woman shared with her friends a heavy sense of disappointment in her relationship with her husband. All her efforts to restore the former harmony did not lead to anything. Realizing the futility of her actions, by September 2014, J.D. realized that she was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. On September 21st, she decided to address herself by writing a letter in which she shared her deep feelings. In the letter, J.D. clearly expresses her desire to be loved and have a normal marriage. She emotionally expressed her feelings and experiences of wanting to be loved by her husband and her desire for close, warm relationships and support. She longed for a normal man who would take care of her and with whom she could build a healthy relationship. JD expressed in her frank letter her frustration and dissatisfaction with her husband's behavior of hiding things from her. This caused her to feel a sense of distrust and uncertainty. She described her state as if her heart had been taken from her and it had been torn and trampled. JD also expressed a desire to spend more time around her husband. In the early spring morning of April 20th, 2015, a Monday, a rented car with 3 stout guys inside stopped near the gate of Staring Gled Village where the young Panayotu couple lived. Their attention was drawn to a fashionably dressed young woman who was impatiently waiting for someone standing by the roadside. 2 of the trio had already started to open the car doors to get out of the car when the driver, who was left behind the wheel, gave them a command to stay in their seats. They watched through the tinted glass of their car as a black BMW parked beside her. She settled into the back seat and the car sped past them, picking up speed. The driver annoyingly slapped his hands on the steering wheel. The next morning, Tuesday at 6:15, JD Panayotu left the house as usual to go to work at the college. It was no more than a 40-minute drive to her place of work, and she was waiting for her friend and co-worker Cheryl in her BMW to go there. She glanced absent-mindedly at the curb where she spotted yesterday's car with tinted windows. Cheryl was running late. JD pulled her cell phone out of her purse with the intention of calling her friend. In her sideways vision, she saw 2 figures coming toward her from the roadside bushes. Cheryl was only 10 minutes late, but JD wasn't at her usual spot. Cheryl had called her phone in vain, and calls to the door of the house were also fruitless. The college also confirmed JD's absence from work. Anxiety rose in Cheryl's heart, and she called the police. By 10 o'clock in the morning, JD Panayotu was announced missing to the media and social media. On the same day, the search for the missing young woman began. In addition to the police and a special canine unit, volunteers from the local community took part in the search. Night fell, but unfortunately there were still no results. In the morning, the search resumed. A reward was announced for any information about JD, then the amount increased. At 10 o'clock in the morning, a canine officer with his dog named Angel discovered the body of JD Panayotu in a bushy ravine near Quano-Bushley. She was fully clothed. The medical examiner found 2 gunshot wounds in her back and 1 shot to the head. Her bank cards and jewelry were gone, as if someone had tried to obfuscate the motives for the murder. It wasn't just an act of violence, it was a low, inhumane act. Who would take the life of such a kind and harmless person? JD's family was in shock. Family and friends couldn't believe this could have happened. JD's students and co-workers were also grieving. The heartache of the terrible tragedy spread like waves in the ocean, far and wide across the country. Social media buzzed with grief and bewilderment. Who could have committed such a despicable and senseless murder? On October 22nd, JD's family held a memorial service at the Catholic Church, and a funeral was held, attended by an unimaginable number of Port Elizabeth residents. So tragic and ridiculous was the young woman's death that it struck the citizens of the city and echoed with pain and compassion in their hearts. Among the family and friends of the deceased were also JD's students and colleagues who came to pay their respects and mourn the young teacher. But apart from people who knew JD Panayotu closely, the city cemetery was attended by operatives of the South African Police Service, whose attention was drawn to the strange behavior of the deceased's husband, Chris. The young businessman's grief looked rather fake. But most of all, the investigative team was surprised by the obviously staged farewell speech of the widower. Having checked its text through search engines on the internet, the police found an incredible similarity of Chris's epitaph with the dedication of Charles Atkins to his late wife. Of course, it was not a direct evidence, but the police officers had a suspicion about Chris Panayotu's involvement in the tragic death of his wife. They decided to keep a close eye on him. In addition, several other suspicious facts pointed to Chris's participation in the murder of his wife. On the eve of the funeral, on the tip-off of special agents, the police arrested on suspicion of possible participation in this atrocious crime one Latonda Seon, who turned out to be a security guard at Chris Panayotu's nightclub. The man gave statements indicating that Chris had approached him to hire killers for his wife, and that he, Latonda Seonde, had found him 3 of his friends. Police also learned that on the day of JD's murder, someone tried to use her bank cards twice. After examining bank surveillance tapes, detectives found images of 2 men who Latonda Seonde identified as his hired killers. Latonda actively cooperated with law enforcement, and they decided to release him from custody on the condition that he complete the task of gathering evidence and Chris's confession to his wife's murder. For this, the authorities promised to commute Latonda Seonde's sentence. Following instructions from the police, Latonda called Chris and summoned him for a confidential conversation, which was recorded with special equipment. In it, Panayotu revealed himself fully, which allowed the investigation to arrest Chris at night, 2 hours after the telephone conversation with Latonda. Soon, based on the detailed testimony of the detainee, 3 more suspects were arrested. After that, the picture of the crime was completely reconstructed by days, hours, and minutes. Chris ordered the hitmen to kill his wife, JD Panayotu, on the morning of April 20th, 2015, when she would be waiting at 6:30 a.m. for her co-worker Cheryl in a car that would take her to work. However, on this day, the perpetrators had a setback. Cheryl arrived to pick up JD in her car a little early to save her friend's life on that spring April morning. The killers were forced to reschedule the execution of the order for the next day, which proved more fortunate for them. On April 21st, JD appeared outside the gates of her community at 6:15 a.m., and the 3 criminals were already there, 2 of them in an ambush, not far from where JD usually waited for her colleague. Now the killers changed their plan. They did not kill JD near the housing estate, but decided to kidnap her, take her to another place, and execute their vile plans there. JD had no time to actively resist, so swift and unexpected was the attack. The 2 men grabbed JD firmly from both sides under her arms, depriving her of maneuverability, and threw her roughly into the back seat of a speeding car. The young woman was so shocked that she didn't even scream or resist. The 2 kidnappers were sitting on either side of her, and there was no way to get out of the speeding car. JD tried to offer the criminals money, but they had other things on their minds. After 30 minutes of fast driving, the car pulled off the dirt road into the woods northwest of the village. They led the young woman to a small ravine, and each fired a revolver once. The men then took the valuables and jewelry in cold blood and threw the body into a small ravine, hastily covering it with brushwood. The criminals then drove to a nearby ATM and withdrew $100 using the murdered woman's bank card. On the same day, they tried to withdraw cash again, but due to an incorrectly entered PIN code, the payment was not executed. Both withdrawal attempts were recorded by surveillance cameras. On October 11, 2015, the trial against Chris and the 2 mercenaries began and generated unprecedented interest throughout the country. The case was covered in all media with detailed details. The prosecution argued that the motive for the murder was financial debt and difficulties in supporting 2 women, Chris's wife and mistress. The trial revealed the key points of the case. Chanel Kutis, Chris's mistress, took the witness stand to testify about the lavish gifts Chris gave her. Her testimony also confirmed that she slept over with Chris when his wife JD was away and described their passionate nights at various hotels in the city. Various pieces of evidence were presented in court, such as records of calls between the hired killers and the bouncer of the Latonda Seonde nightclub, ATM videos, and pictures confirming withdrawals, GPS coordinates of the location of the hidden car, and other evidence that pointed to the defendant's involvement in the murder. The court discussed the financial situation of Chris, who appeared to be having difficulty supporting both women. This created a motive to get rid of one of them. The mysterious death of the 3rd defendant just before the trial began added to the mystery of the case. He may have been an important witness for the prosecution, or may have had information that could have been even more damaging to Chris and his co-defendants. The court concluded that there was sufficient evidence to support the involvement of Chris and the mercenaries in the murder. Their motivation was related to the financial problems and life difficulties of Chris, who decided that getting rid of one of the women would be the solution to his problems. JD's story is a true tragedy. Her life was too short and full of injustice. All the witnesses called by the court described JD as a kind and devoted woman. Her death, was a loss to all who knew and loved her. The court clearly concluded that Chris killed his wife out of greed to avoid financial problems. This motive makes his act even more inhumane and cruel. Chris's actions show how some people can go to extreme lengths for their own gain. Chris, as well as the two hired killers, received a life sentence. This is a just punishment for such a horrible crime. Laitancioni had yet to be fully sentenced because he went to cooperate with law enforcement. However, there are still some mysterious and unexpected 6 moments in this tragic story. The tragic death of Chris's father, Costa Panayotou, on December 9, 2019, added more mystery and grief for the already existing tragedy. Chris's affair with a store worker and Costa Panayotou's unwillingness to accept this choice of his son could have been a source of family conflict and tension. It is not yet clear who killed Costa Panayotou and why. This horrific crime leaves many unanswered questions and adds an element of mystery to an already complicated situation. The situation of Chris Panayotou, who put his own interests and desires above the life and well-being of his wife and family, is one of intense outrage and condemnation. If his actions were related to the death of his father, it would add even more complexity to an already horrible situation. If Chris Panayotou had anything to do with his father's death, he should be punished for yet another crime. Either way, this horrible man now will never go free. Acts committed foolishly and because of the young age sometimes can break the entire future life and have the most unpredictable, even tragic consequences. In the story known as The Case of Daisy Coleman, intertwined the fate of several young girls who became victims of their own naivety and carelessness. They believed that this will soon be forgotten and life will return to its former course, but they were wrong. Each of the schoolgirls was subjected to cruel bullying by classmates and those whom they used to consider friends. In 2016, a documentary called Audrey and Daisy told the stories of girls who were victims of violence and bullying. These stories took place in different places and at different times, and the girls did not even know each other. But the picture clearly showed that psychological violence is often more difficult to survive than physical violence. But let's start at the beginning. The Coleman family. It was a large, friendly, and quite hacky family which could be called exemplary. They lived in the small town of Albany, Missouri. Spouses Michael and Melinda were married for many years and raised 4 children together. Sons, Charlie, Tristan, and Logan, as well as a daughter, Daisy. She was the second child and the only girl in the family. Both parents worked in the medical field. Only Michael was a surgeon and his wife a veterinarian. They were considered respected people in their town. All family members were sports fans and cheered for local teams. In 2009, when Daisy was 12 years old, she and her father and older brother traveled by car to a neighboring town to attend a soccer game. However, the weather turned bad that day, and the car skidded on the wet road, resulting in a collision with a car that was traveling in the oncoming lane. The father of the family died on the spot, but the children fortunately were not seriously injured. The Coleman family was bereaved, and they soon decided to move to another city for a change of scenery. The family settled in Maryville, still in the same state of Missouri, where the children went to one of the local schools, and the mother got a job at a veterinary center. Gradually, they recovered from the loss and began to make plans for the future. Daisy was actively engaged in dancing and gymnastics, and was also a member of the school cheerleading team. In addition, the girl discovered another talent. She drew very beautifully and dreamed of becoming an artist or designer in the future. At school, she had many friends who characterized her as bright, kind, open, and cheerful. Daisy had a best friend named Paige, with whom they were practically inseparable. The girls went to school together, were on the same cheerleading team, and attended the same dance studio. They often stayed overnight at each other's houses, which became a common occurrence. On January 7th, 2012, when school was on winter break, Paige once again stayed overnight at her friend's house. They watched movies, ate sweets, and chatted. And when everyone went to bed, Daisy sneaked down to the home wine cabinet and stole a bottle of hot liquor from there, which she and her friend drank. After midnight, Daisy began texting a local hottie, 17-year-old Matthew Barnett, who was considered one of the most popular guys in school and was an up-and-coming soccer player. He was friends with her older brother, Charlie, with whom they were in the same class and often visited the Coleman family home. Daisy was flattered by the attention of a grown boy, and she was eager to chat and flirt with him. When she wrote that she was spending the night with a friend, Matthew invited the girls to a party at his house, suggesting that they have fun without their parents. They eagerly accepted his offer and quietly left the house, escaping through Daisy's bedroom window. Soon Matthew and his buddy came to pick them up, and the young men headed to his house, where several other kids from their school were waiting for them. Nightmare party. The party was held in the basement of the house, which the young people got into through the garage. As soon as Daisy and Paige went inside, they were offered alcoholic cocktails that the guys had made themselves. Matthew was particularly persistent. He poured Daisy one drink after another, and she drank it eagerly, trying to impress him. At one point, Paige tried to intervene because she thought her friend was already pretty drunk, but she was asked to stay out of it. At the party was a guy named Nicholas, whom Paige had long had a crush on. He approached her and started flirting with her. They drank together, and afterward, the high schooler offered her privacy in another room. Paige agreed, realizing what would happen next. Their intimacy didn't last long, and when they went back inside, Daisy wasn't in the large room. The door of the next room where the bed was slightly ajar, and Paige saw that her friend was lying there almost unconscious, and Matthew, taking advantage of her condition, had become intimate with her. In addition, another member of the party, named Jordan, was filming what was happening on his cell phone. As it later turned out, he also took advantage of Daisy's unconsciousness and had sexual intercourse with her. The boys put the girls in the car and drove them back to Daisy's house. Paige had sobered up a little by then, but her friend was still half conscious and unable to stand on her own. Soon, Daisy started throwing up, and the guys literally dragged her out of the car. While Daisy was vomiting, Matthew tried to gather her hair, but he was not doing a good job. Daisy's hair and clothes ended up soiled. The guys told Paige to go inside, and they would stay with her friend until she sobered up a bit. Paige believed them and went back into the room through the window without waking anyone. She laid down on the bed, and since she was still drunk, fell asleep right away. In fact, the boys tricked Paige, and as soon as she returned to the house, they left Daisy lying on the cold ground on a January night, having first taken off her jacket. They later explained their actions by saying that they were afraid someone would see them with a drunken minor and call the police. They allegedly took off the jacket because Daisy was vomiting and had soiled it. Apparently, Daisy lay outside in sub-zero temperatures for several hours before she came to her senses. According to her recollection, at first she thought she was dead because she couldn't feel her limbs, couldn't move or scream. She was also not wearing shoes or socks, but no one could explain where they had gone. Her wet hair was frozen to the lawn, and she had to make an effort to lift her head and look around. Daisy crawled to the doorstep of her own house and slammed her hand on the front door several times. Somehow Maline's mother woke up from the noise and, thinking it was the dog asking to come inside, went to open the door. Melinda almost lost her senses when she saw her daughter lying on the porch in a helpless and semi-conscious state, undressed and without shoes. The mother shouted and woke her sons, who immediately rushed over and helped to carry her sister into the house. She was wearing only a t-shirt and thin pants, and her limbs showed signs of frostbite. Daisy could not speak, but only sobbed occasionally. She was shaking violently and smelled of alcohol. At first, the mother tried to keep her daughter warm by wrapping her in blankets, but quickly realized that it wouldn't help, so she told her sons to carry her sister into the bathtub. There, Melinda began removing her daughter's clothes and saw that her thighs were covered on the inside with bruises and abrasions. She immediately realized that her daughter had been abused and called the police and medics. Until they arrived, the mother warmed Daisy with warm water. As a medical professional, she knew what to do in such cases to avoid harm and minimize the negative effects of frostbite. At the hospital, Daisy's condition raised serious concerns. Tests showed that her blood alcohol level was twice as high as normal. Her body showed signs of frostbite, as well as the consequences of rough intercourse with bruises and lacerations in the perineum. It was impossible to interrogate Daisy because the events of the previous night had been almost completely erased from her memory. Then the police decided to question Paige, who told them everything that had happened to them. The friends admitted that they took a bottle of alcohol in the home bar without permission, hoping that no one would notice it. The contents of the bottle they managed to drink, so when the guys invited them to their home, they were already drunk. Paige had told them about the intimacy and that Jordan had videotaped what Matthew had done to the unconscious Daisy. Now it was necessary to interrogate the guys, study the video, and find the victim's cell phone, which she didn't have with her. After searching the grounds of the house, the police found Daisy's gadget in the snow on the lawn. The phone saved her correspondence with Matthew, which was quite intimate. The very next day, all three boys were taken to the police station for questioning. Matthew confessed that he had organized a party in his house, to which he invited two girls. He confirmed that the girlfriends were already drunk when they came to them, but they, according to him, were aware of their actions, understood what was going on, and willingly agreed to everything. At first, Matthew categorically denied that he had bought Daisy a drink, but soon began to confuse his own testimony and confessed that he poured her alcohol to melt the ice in her heart. But he insisted that Daisy was conscious during the intimacy and that it was consensual, using contraception. Matthew went on to say that he drove Daisy and Paige home. Daisy felt sick, she was vomiting, and then he decided to take off her jacket so she wouldn't get dirty. Her shoes, he reasoned, she had taken off by herself for some reason. The young man assured that when he and his friends left, they were sure that Daisy had gone to her house. Jordan admitted that he filmed Matthew and Daisy's intimacy on his phone and even managed to show the video to a few friends, but then decided to delete it. Nicholas also admitted that he and Paige had sexual intercourse and noted that she was okay with it. After questioning, all three guys were taken into custody. Nicholas was the only one who did not deny, cooperated with the police, and confessed to everything, and was the first one who was immediately sent to a juvenile detention center. Detectives found the situation with his friends less clear-cut. The local sheriff sided with Matthew and even praised him for taking the girls home, but the sheriff deliberately omitted the fact that one of the friends was left in the cold in a semi-conscious state, previously undressed. Also, for some unknown reason, the video, which was filmed by Jordan and which could have helped to shed light on the state in which Daisy was during the intimacy, was not even tried to restore, considering this detail irrelevant. Crucial to the trial was Daisy's testimony, which she gave on the very first day she was in hospital. She did not, as I said, remember the events of that night, but when asked by a police officer whether she herself could have offered intimacy in exchange for alcohol, Daisy allowed for that possibility. Later, Coleman denied this, saying she didn't hear the question and was still not well aware of what was going on. But this verbal trap allowed the charges against Matthew and Jordan to be dropped. In addition, as it turns out, Matthew Barnett's grandfather, who was once a police officer himself and later went into politics and became a state representative, became involved. Moreover, the sheriff, who empathized with the guys, noted in court that he did not consider the girls to be victims at all. In the end, the young men were acquitted and released from the courtroom. Physically, Daisy recovered a few weeks after those terrible events, but mentally, she remained a wreck. Daisy went back to school, hoping to return to a normal life, but instead of support and sympathy, she faced severe peer bullying. Most of the students took the side of the popular handsome Matthew, and Daisy and Paige were called liars and easy girls, ready to give themselves for a bottle of alcohol. Coleman was kicked off the school cheerleading squad and literally became a pariah everywhere she went, even though her brothers tried to stick up for her. Daisy regularly received anonymous calls and texts that were abusive or threatening, and her mother received similar messages. Her best friend and her mother stopped communicating because she was also a victim of bullying and had to transfer to another school. Gradually, Daisy fell into a deep depression, began to avoid any contact with others, and even tried to settle accounts with life. The last straw was the arson of the Coleman's house, after which they finally convinced themselves that it was simply not safe for them to stay in the city and decided to move to another state where Daisy could normally finish school. A few years later, when Daisy was already in college, an influential online publication publicized her story and once again drew public interest in Daisy. This time, however, a host of people across the country, many of whom had experienced something similar or had also been victims of bullying, stepped forward to speak up for her. And soon, a documentary film, Audrey and Daisy, was made, raising the issue of violence, harassment, and bullying. The second character in the story was a girl named Audrey Pott, who lived in California. A similar story happened to her at about the same young age, after which she also became an outcast. The schoolgirl fell into a depression from which she could no longer get out of, and took her own life. Before leaving, she wrote on her internet page that her life was destroyed, and she saw no point in hanging on to it any longer. This documentary project and the public support it received inspired the Coleman family to continue to fight for justice and get the investigation reopened. This time, Matthew Barnett was still found guilty, but was sentenced to only 4 months of probation, and he also paid the victim a laughable amount of less than $2,000. After graduating from college, Daisy moved to Colorado, where she planned to start her life with a clean slate. She found a use for her talent as an artist, taking a job as a master at a tattoo parlor. At the same time, Daisy was offered to take part in another documentary project, and she readily accepted. For a while, it seemed to her that everything was getting better, but in the summer of 2018, trouble came to her family again. Mom and younger brother Tristan decided to visit Daisy and went to her by car. But on the way to another state, they got into a car accident, as a result of which the young man died on the spot, and Melinda was taken to the hospital with serious injuries. This tragedy undermined Daisy's already unstable emotional state. She became withdrawn again, didn't want to socialize with anyone, and withdrew into herself. On top of that, she learned that she would never be able to have children. She was saved from a desperate step only by her favorite work and creativity, and she reflected her pain and fears in drawings and sketches. Soon, Daisy began to complain that a stranger was stalking her. She again received threatening and abusive messages, but worst of all, he repeatedly came to her house. She began to feel as if a nightmare from her past life had returned to drive her completely insane. Coleman went to the police several times, talking about the mysterious stalker and that she felt threatened by him, but her statements went unheeded. In addition, Daisy discovered that the second key to her house was missing and assumed that the man stalking her had stolen it. On August 4, 2020, police arrived at Daisy's house, called by Melinda. She couldn't reach her daughter and assumed the worst, so she called for help, asking the police to drive over and see if everything was okay. Daisy was home and admitted she was very scared, but the police found no intruders, either in the house or nearby, and so quickly left. A couple hours later, Daisy called her boyfriend via video link. She was crying, talking about how she couldn't take it anymore, and then pulled a gun out of her desk drawer and shot herself. The guy immediately reported the incident to the emergency services and went to his beloved, but it was too late. Daisy died at the age of 23. Daisy became the third member of the family to pass away prematurely. Her mother, Melinda, couldn't come to terms with the loss. She posted almost daily on social media reminiscing about her daughter, apologizing to her, and saying she wished she could take her pain on herself. A few months later, the 58-year-old woman left one last post with an old photo of all her children together. She admitted that she couldn't bear to live with the pain, and afterward she voluntarily left this world, shooting herself just as her daughter had done. Of the once large, loving, and happy family of 6, only brothers Charlie and Logan remained. When they wanted to take some of their sister's belongings as a memento of her, it turned out that the salon where she worked had been robbed and the albums with her exclusive sketches were stolen. As for Matthew Barnett, his life is quite successful now. He graduated from a prestigious college and decided to follow in the footsteps of his influential grandfather. When Matthew learned about the death of his mother and daughter Coleman, He dryly expressed his condolences on his page on the internet.